Right, so good afternoon from Singapore. Good morning to you joining from Brussels. It's a very wet and windy Singapore here today, but I hope you're all having better weather where you are elsewhere listening in. Welcome to the third of our webinars from the EU-ASEAN Business Council on sustainability issues. Today we are talking about the European Green Deal and how it may impact on ASEAN businesses and future trade relations between the EU and ASEAN. We have a very distinguished panel and we have a very experienced moderator today. The moderator is Noel Klihan, who is the Head of Global Affairs for BDO, a very prominent and very active member with the Business Council and a very good friend of mine as well. And I'll hand over to Noel now to introduce his panel and the topic. Over to you, Noel.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to you from Brussels and to this webinar. As Chris says, the third in a series of webinars on the topics of sustainability. Chris has already said who I'm from, BDO, and I'm a member of the supervisory board of the EU-ASEAN. My privilege to moderate today's webinar, and we are expecting over 260 participants on today's webinar, which I think is testament to the interest in the theme, which is understanding the EU's Green Deal and its implications for ASEAN businesses. Just a word of housekeeping before we get going. All of our participants today are muted and your cameras are similarly blocked. We do hope to do about 30 minutes of remarks and discussion among the panel, followed by questions and answers emanating from you, the participants. So in terms of questions that strike you, either during the earlier part or later when we get to the formal Q&A, please put those into the Q&A function of this webinar. And Chris and his team will be monitoring those and streaming them to me to coordinate and consolidate the questions that seem to resonate with most of the participants. Today's webinar is on the record. So at that, let me start by welcoming our expert panel, each of whom will speak for a number of minutes. Probably Jake will speak a little longer to set out the background of what the Green Deal is. And then we hope to engage in a discussion amongst ourselves to ventilate some of the key aspects of the Green Deal, some of the concerns of businesses and those in ASEAN on this EU initiative, and of course to speak about areas of agreement and where ASEAN could prosper and profit from the EU Green Deal. In the interest of maximizing the time available to the discussion, I'm not going to read out the extensive biographies of our three panelists. You've all had access to that in your invitation to today. So very briefly, our first speaker and panelist, Jacob Worksman, is the Principal Advisor in the Directorate for Climate Action in the European Commission and a huge expert on the whole Green Deal, sustainability, development goals, Paris Climate Accord, that whole area. As I said, I won't read his CV, it speaks for itself, but we're really fortunate to have Jake here today to set the scene and explain in detail what the Green Deal is and its implications both in Europe and beyond. Second up will be Cathy Roussel from Amphori. Cathy is the Policy and Government Affairs Manager at the Amphori organization, which is over 40 years in existence and is an organization that coordinates the business views, the businesses with an interest in sustainable trade and free and open trade also. So Cathy will give us the view of businesses coming from that perspective. And last but not least, Debbie Elms. Certainly those of you in Asia don't need any introduction to Debbie, who's a noted commentator and expert on trade issues and never slow to express strong views, Debbie. So we look forward to hearing those today. Debbie is the Executive Director of the Asia Trade Center, and as I said, an extensive palmares and CV, all of which you have in the invitation for today. So we're going to speak about the Green Deal and its implications for ASEAN, businesses in ASEAN. I guess we should start with what the Green Deal is. I'm not going to steal Jake's thunder, but it is one of the signature policies of this European Commission, which took office last year, 2019. It's one of its key policy agendas. And of course, COVID-19 has come along in the meantime since that commission took office. So we'd be interested to see what the implications for the Green Deal are as a result of COVID-19, and more particularly given the recovery packages that have been put in place at EU level, at national level, and multilateral level if you take the IMF and others into account. I'm not going to try and explain the Green Deal. I think that's probably best done by Jake. So at that, Jake, I'm going to ask you to kick off for us for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we move on to Kathy and Debbie. Over to you, Jake. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Noel. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you perfectly clearly, yes. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, let me then get started. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this event. I'm speaking to you from my home in Brussels, where the Commission is still in essentially teleworking conditions, but very much connecting to the world through events like this. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to present our plans. So yes, I'm going to provide a sketch of the European Green Deal, which, as Noel indicates, is really the manifesto of this Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, which started towards the end of last year and will have 5 years to implement these policies. But as I will be demonstrating, we'll be setting in train a pathway that will affect many decades of European policy developments to come. So I'll provide a sketch of the Green Deal, but I think it's important to keep in mind that many of the details that I've been describing are works in progress. These are primarily proposals that are coming from the Commission in its unique role in the European Union system of initiating policy and initiating legislation. But many aspects of it still need to be agreed by our leaders, by our ministers, and in certain circumstances by the European Parliament, the directly elected co-legislator within the EU system as well, before they become full EU policies. So I'll try to indicate where things are still work in progress, but the starting frame of my comments will be the European Commission's communication on the European Green Deal and subsequent communications which sketch out the Commission's vision of where Europe will go next. First and foremost, the European Green Deal represents a commitment to growth and transformation of the European economy and the European society to one that is more sustainable, to one that is more innovative in its character, and also to one that is more just in its nature, in the sense that it has very important elements that ensure and are designed to ensure that no aspect of European society is left behind as we transform it into one that is greener and more digital in its character. It's a manifesto of the Commission that was very much backed by the European Parliament, which was elected just before this Commission came into place, with the strongest presence of green and progressive parties than ever before, as well as a number of local elections in member states that also reflected a strong commitment of European voters, European consumers, European political parties to a sustainability transformation. It also was very much supported by the voices of youth in the street, which, although they've been off the streets as a result of COVID recently, their voices were very strongly heard by politicians and policymakers around Europe. And we expect that continued support from this new generation to influence the way in which these policies are designed. And it's also a response from the European Union to a call for leadership from the EU, from this region of ASEAN, but also from regions around the world that expect highly industrialized countries and economies like those within the European Union to take the lead on many of these sustainability issues, in particular on climate change. Secondly, it's much more than just about climate change. Though coming from DG Klima, a lot of my remarks will focus primarily on what we're doing to ensure that the EU moves towards a low carbon and climate resilient future. Very important pillars of the Green Deal include the stemming of biodiversity loss within the EU and around the world, including the reform of our agricultural policies to achieve that, a focus on the circular economy, which we know is much discussed within the ASEAN region as well, the need to reduce waste in the way in which we produce and consume goods and services, and a very strong emphasis on what we call the digital transition, making sure that as part of the EU's investment becoming more innovative as an economy and as a society, that we build the digital infrastructure to make that possible as well. So it's much more than just about climate change, the European Green Deal. It represents, as I said, 5 years of a policy plan of this Commission, but very much aimed at the medium and long-term objectives. And that includes the important need from the Commission's point of view, to significantly enhance the ambition of our 2030 target, which is the one that we have lodged within the Paris Agreement as our nationally determined contribution, which is currently a commitment to reduce our emissions from 1990 levels by at least 40% domestically. And the Commission is proposing we move that target to 50 to 55%. So that's a midterm goal that lasts beyond the life of this Commission, but is very important in terms of describing the pathway that we intend to be on in later decades. It also includes, very importantly, a commitment that has been endorsed by all EU leaders to ensure that the European Union is climate neutral, so net zero in terms of its emissions by 2050. So the even longer term pathway is incredibly important for our planning, and the European Green Deal in the next 5 years will make contributions to ensuring that we're on that pathway to net zero emissions within the EU as well. The policies that we will be proposing in the coming months and years will build on the foundations of almost 2 decades of climate policy within the EU, aspects that will be familiar to those that follow a European climate policy design, aspects such as the European emissions trading system, which caps and trades emissions allowances within covered sectors, mostly the power and manufacturing sector, but also targets around the increase of renewable energy as a share of our energy mix, the importance of promoting energy efficiency, particularly in the building sector, but also increasingly policies to promote the electrification of our transport sector, as well as changes in the way in which we manage land and forests within the EU to ensure that they're contributing to a net zero pathway as well. So it builds on these foundations of existing policies, but will clearly require a lot of policy innovation as well in order to achieve these more ambitious goals. And we'll be touching upon a number of these elements as I'm sure as our conversation moves on. So as Noel pointed out, these were the plans at the beginning of this year, and then of course COVID struck. And so policymakers had to quickly turn their attention, as they did around the world, to the immediate needs of dealing with the health crisis and the jobs and the economic crisis that quickly followed on from that. So it wasn't long before the European leaders turned to the Commission and said, well, we now have to think about rescue and recovery. And so a new major communication emerged from the Commission in the past couple of weeks, which focuses on that recovery package. And it talks about the relationship between the existing European Green Deal plans and these new plans that will have to be put in place to ensure that the European economy, European society recovers quickly as a result of what we expect to be a very significant downturn in our growth and our productivity. This new communication, which is called the Next Generation Communication, EU Next Generation, is called that, is entitled that, because it depends very heavily on our being able to borrow from and therefore essentially invest in the next generation. It's a package of 750 billion euros of grants and investments in the European economy designed to stimulate a rapid recovery from the COVID crisis. And because it incurs debt, it requires an additional responsibility in today's politicians to make investments that respond to the concerns of the younger generation that is emerging, and that is very much consistent with investments in sustainable development. So if you look at that communication, you will see, not surprisingly, that the logic of the European Green Deal persists in the priorities that are being set for the investment of these resources. So growth, innovation, jobs, bringing the public along with us, leaving no one behind. These are all themes that come directly from the European Green Deal and into this new EU Next Generation communication. In terms of the themes of building back better and doing no harm, in terms of the way in which the European economy will be designed, all of those are built in as principles into the investments that will flow from the EU Next Generation. The 2050 climate neutrality target has been confirmed by EU leaders in the midst of the COVID crisis. and the Commission is committed to remaining on track with regard to the 2030 proposal that I mentioned before in terms of raising our midterm ambition and keeping us on track for fulfilling the commitments that we've made under the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm sure this audience is going to be particularly interested in the external dimension of the European Green Deal and the EU Next Generation Recovery Plan. And it has essentially three main elements of it that have remained consistent from the Green Deal to the Recovery Plan, and very much built upon the concepts of solidarity and support that you can expect from the EU in terms of external relations in the area of sustainable development. It has three main elements. One is a continued investment. The second is the development of our trade policies. And the thirdly, which is still emerging, a better understanding of the role that debt and debt relief can play in the context of recovery that is green and sustainable in its character. In terms of investment, we will respect the commitments that we've made under the Paris Agreement and elsewhere to maintain the level of development cooperation that we've had in the pre-COVID situation. So the numbers that you see within this proposed budget from the Commission are the same as we had expected to provide previously. That envelope remains intact. The work that we've been doing on developing a taxonomy of what are sustainable investments will also guide the way in which the resources that we will be investing in development cooperation will be applied. The SDGs, the commitments that our partners have made in terms of their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, these are all expected to guide the way in which we would invest in other countries' economies as well. Trade policy very much remained focused on using trade as an instrument to encourage sustainable development around the world, whether it's bilaterally through free trade agreements of the kind that we're negotiating within the ASEAN region, or it's the work that we will continue to do within the WTO to invest in making sure that that organization continues to be relevant, or the policies that we put in place domestically that are necessary to achieve our objectives that have a trade aspect to them. And I know that there will be questions coming from the audience about the way in which we're ensuring that our renewable energy strategies, to the extent that they rely upon biofuels, are designed to ensure that those biofuel feedstocks are sustainable in their character. And concerns that as we become more ambitious within the EU, we ensure that we have techniques and methods in place to prevent carbon leakage from industries within the EU that are energy intensive in their character to production processes elsewhere around the world. So we can come back to those aspects, but those are the three main aspects of our external dimension of the Green Deal, including primarily to encourage sustainable development around the world through investment and trade policies. Debt relief is something that we're still thinking through. As the EU, we've been very supportive of the early moves that the IMF and the other international financial institutions have been making to ensure that there is liquidity in a context where countries may need to borrow more in order to help themselves through the COVID crisis. So let me stop there. I've already spoken a lot more than I probably should have, but as you asked me to make this first sketch of the Green Deal and the way in which it's been essentially remaining intact in the context of the COVID crisis, I took the liberty of doing that. But look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists, but also to the questions and answers to come. Thanks.
It would help if I unmuted myself. Thank you, Jake. I think you've done a great job in capturing in just over 10 minutes the genesis and motivations of the Green Deal, which is, of course, an enormous and overarching plan. And we could probably spend hours getting into the detail of it, but you've also captured the three external elements of it very well. So hopefully that sets up the discussion nicely for our fellow panelists. At that, I pass over to Kathy, who's going to maybe give us the thoughts of Amfori, who are a business community looking at developing sustainable trade. So Kathy, over to you.
Thank you, Noel. So good morning, everyone. So first of all, thank you very much for having invited me to contribute to these discussions this morning. At Amfori, we represent about 2,400 international retailers, importers, brand companies, and most of our members source and even operate branch offices and have stores in the ASEAN region, which is why we were very happy when we heard about the decision about a year ago to upgrade the EU-ASEAN relationship to a strategic partnership. So Amphori, our role is to support our members in improving the sustainability of their supply chain by providing them with the right tools to monitor their human rights and environmental impacts. So as such, we've been organizing hundreds of events and workshops and meetings to promote sustainable trade, also some in the ASEAN region. So about the Green Deal, the way we see things at Amphori, we believe that the European Green Deal could well be a game changer, in the sense that not only it sets a very high level of ambition, because the EU aims to become climate neutral by 2050, which is not a small thing, but also because of the timing. Of course, when the Green Deal was communicated, we didn't expect the COVID pandemic to occur, but given that the Green Deal also basically set the objectives and the condition for the new EU growth economy strategy, I think it will probably help to define what the future recovery post-COVID-19 will be. And so, as I said before, the agenda is, the ambition is very high. And to reach that goal of being climate neutral, it would probably require to make sustainable products a norm in the EU. And the Commission will propose legislation to ensure that products on the markets are designed to last longer, are easier to reuse, repair, and recycle. And no doubt that this will require the European industry to reconsider the business model. So, of course, as Jakob said earlier, the EU is still working on the details of this Green Deal. But what is already clear is that achieving a climate neutral and circular economy will require the mobilization of the industry and a transformation of value chains. So I'm sorry, we are monitoring this topic very closely, and we even organized a project group on circular economy. But we believe that it will be a very long journey to go to get there. And it would probably be hard for the EU to achieve circular economy and to work on the priorities set by the Commission with the Green Deal in isolation. So to achieve a real impact that will bring new opportunities to businesses inside and outside the EU, we will need a strong collaboration between the EU and its trading partners. I see that ASEAN countries have already shown leadership in building a new and sustainable economy as well. So if I remember well, Myanmar adopted a low carbon growth strategy well before the Paris Agreement. More recently, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, they've been launching plans to tackle the issue of plastic pollution as well. So it's also a big issue in the ASEAN region. And historically, the region, the ASEAN region has been prone to greater hazards given its geographical location. So it makes it more vulnerable to climate change induced events. So I believe this has made the region more acutely aware of the sustainability and resilience challenges. And in the current difficult context of the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences, I believe that both the EU and ASEAN countries have much to learn from each other on how to balance economic development and social pressure with environmental protection. So that would be all from me for now.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That's the views of the Amphori membership, 2,400 companies, I think you said. Now let's go over to Debbie in Asia to get the views of maybe the Asian business community and some thoughts on Jake's opening remarks about the Green Deal and its external reach. Debbie, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm a little nervous about representing Asia on this call, but I'll do what I can. And I know that Chris invited me to participate because he knew that I would be controversial. So here goes. Last night I went out for dinner here in Singapore for the first time in 3 months because we've been locked down. And my experience was, I think, interesting. Because the local dumpling joint is no longer allowed to have condiments on the table, all of the condiments were supplied separately to each table. So everyone got the little bowls of condiments, some of which got used, some of which got thrown out. We were all given plastic Ziploc bags to put our masks in, because you have to wear a mask unless you're in your own house. So we had to have our masks in Ziploc bags. We went afterwards to get coffee, and the coffee company no longer accepts reusable cups for refill to protect the customer, the employee's hands from the passing of the virus and so forth. These are problematic policies. Of course, they're partly COVID related. And when COVID ends, you're going to say to me, well, we're not going to need plastic bags anymore to put our masks in. But I would say that the challenge we have in Asia is that this was already a part of the world that, while they are enthusiastic, as every human being must be, surely, about protecting the environment in the abstract, and we would all like to leave a better, cleaner world for our children, the difficulty is matching up that aspiration of having a better, cleaner world for our children with the practical, how do you get there today in the business community? And that's always been a stretch. And coming out of COVID, I think it's going to be an even bigger stretch, because, firms are shedding employees, watching markets shrink, watching challenging economic times. And so then they're going to say to themselves, is this the moment in which I want to invest in climate-friendly recovery? Now, again, in principle, sounds fantastic. Of course, who wouldn't want to take advantage of an opportunity and make it better? But I think it's going to be a little bit tricky for firms who are grappling with cost, restructuring, challenging operational times. I think it's going to be tough. You compound that with, and this is the connection to the Green Deal as well, the new rules coming out of Europe that make it particularly challenging for this part of the world, or that may make it challenging as they evolve. And I think this is going to be very tricky. So let me give you an example. We had this lovely phrase that we need to prevent carbon leakage. Okay, prevent carbon, it sounds great. Who wants carbon to leak? Nobody. Sounds great. What does that mean in practice? That means in practice here in Asia that we in Asia, who are manufacturing goods in particular, will have to think about Europe's rules on preventing carbon leakage. Well, what does that mean practically for the, whatever it is now, 150 people who are on this call, many of whom run businesses in the region? It means that you have to care, if you ship anything to Europe, about Europe's carbon policies, which may or may not have anything to do with your local carbon policies. It means that you need to be thinking about, crucially, paying for carbon that as it crosses over the border into the EU in the form of some kind of carbon border adjustment tax. Because if you don't have that in place, then the European companies will argue that we have an unlevel playing field. I, in Europe, have to ensure that the manufacturer of this coffee cup takes into account the carbon embedded in this cup, whereas something imported from Vietnam, from Singapore, from wherever, doesn't have to do so in the same way. So how do we have a level playing field? We put up a carbon tax or some other kind of adjustment at the border to make sure that domestic firms have a level playing field. Now that sounds lovely from Europe. That is going to be a big adjustment here in Asia and in ASEAN in particular. So I think that the challenge that we have, before I finish my opening comments, is to say that this is a bit tricky to manage the aspirations, the plans, the policies, the broad statements by both Europe and by Asian governments with the reality of business plans on the ground and with consumer demands on the ground, because Asian consumers are not in the same space. And again, it's a big, broad space to talk about Asian consumers when we have, whatever, almost 3 billion consumers, depending on how we define Asia, who all want kind of different things. But the enthusiasm in general for sustainability, for green, for climate friendly, is not anywhere near the same space that it is in Europe. And so I think this disconnect, which is difficult anyways, COVID makes it harder. So how do we manage to bridge that gap, I think is going to be an interesting challenge for certainly the rest of the Commission's time in office.
Thank you, Debbie. You certainly have responded forcefully with some of your thoughts to Jake's opening remarks. Jake, maybe I'll give you a right reply at this stage. I'm also maybe reflecting some of the earlier questions that I see. I think Debbie used the word a stretch. Is this the moment to ask people to invest in climate-friendly recovery? And I guess that question probably can be equally sourced from businesses in Europe, many of whom might see business as usual as more of the imperative rather than any costly investments in green at this time, much as they may subscribe to them at heart and in principle. So is this the time to invest in green recovery, or should we get back to business as usual and then look to green a little bit further down the road?
Well, thanks, and I certainly appreciate the challenge of moving from high level rhetoric, which we do hear from lots of governments, to the practical challenges of businesses in participating in markets. But that high level rhetoric does commit us to what is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to avoid the worst dangers of climate change, which I think, as previous speakers have noted, are very immediately felt within the ASEAN region. And so within that rapidly closing window, we do have to make some pretty dramatic transformations in the way in which we produce and consume goods and the way in which those are traded around the world. And that will cause disruption, it will cause confusion, it will require adjustments. And I think the challenge that we have as governments to markets, and our responsibility to markets, is to make sure that those transitions are as smooth as possible, given that they do have to be accelerated, and we cannot postpone those choices and those decisions. All countries that have joined the Paris Agreement have signed up to the concept that we need to be net zero globally by as soon as possible in this century, and the EU has taken lead by saying, well, we will be a first mover and move there by 2050. We will do so in the context of an economy that is very interconnected with the rest of the world, and so as we decarbonize, we have to make sure that it's not causing increased emissions elsewhere. But the answer to the question of what does it mean in practice, which will be on everyone's mind in terms of the impacts of first mover climate policies on their trading partners, the answer to that question will be very different in different circumstances. We have some insight into what it will mean for palm oil producers in Indonesia as a result of the renewable energy legislation that I referred to in our opening remarks. But I can assure you that the border carbon adjustment that Deborah referred to will not be applied to plastic coffee cups. That's not the nature of that kind of a policy. So we can't really know the practical implications until we know more about the policies. We're trying to be as transparent and participatory in the development of those policies as possible. So anyone on this call can log in to the Commission website and provide their comments, as many have done, as we develop the impact assessment for the design of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as we call it within the EU. But we will have to participate in, try to influence and shape the design of that particular policy, but the practical implications are not yet known. But I can assure you that they would not be applied to a plastic coffee cup. They may be applied to more primary products, such as steel, is a classic example, where the costs of production around the world are very different, in part as a result of the difference of the price of carbon that's experienced in different jurisdictions around the world. And that is what we call a energy-intensive, trade-exposed industry in the EU. And we want to be able to decarbonize that sector without losing that sector within our economy, or having carbon leakage occur in jurisdictions that would be importing steel from. And so that would be an example where you might, as a result of the design of this policy, experience as an importer an additional charge with regard to steel that would have been produced in a carbon-intensive manner.
I'm conscious, Jake, that we're looking at the implications for ASEAN business, but I just want to ask you one question that has come up on the Q&A function, which is, do you think carbon adjustment taxes will start popping up in other places, such as the Korean Green Deal, in response to the EU's leadership? You did say EU wants to be a first mover and is a first mover in this space. So that particular initiative, carbon border adjustment, I know the detail is yet to be worked out, but do you foresee that cropping up elsewhere, for example, in the Korean equivalent deal?
I think it is the kind of policy that encourages economies to think about reciprocity, because if one economy is making an adjustment, another economy will look at what kinds of adjustments it sees as appropriate as well. I think you see this in the context of border tax adjustments that are part of trading currently with regard to VAT and other forms of internal taxes. We can draw a little bit from the experience of the last effort in the United States to develop comprehensive climate change legislation. And in the proposals that made it through at least one house of their legislature, border carbon adjustments were a part of that proposal for many of the same reasons that they are being considered within the EU. So I would say that it's unlikely that the EU would be the only jurisdiction with a significant economy that's exposed to these kinds of risks to take that step.
Okay. Questions coming in for Debbie and Kathy also. Reaching the net zero 2050 targets requires an enormous investment of both public and private money, some estimates of €1 trillion over the next decade. To what extent do either European businesses or even ASEAN businesses see the stimulus packages as driving that recovery and facilitating the investment that might be necessary, either by European businesses or by ASEAN businesses? Maybe Debbie, you might go first on that one.
Yeah, so far, I mean, sitting here in Singapore, we've had 4 rounds of economic packages totaling almost 20% of GDP. And as far as I'm aware, and it's difficult to keep track of them, apparently there are 621 different schemes, support schemes for jobs and so forth. So keeping track of them all is hard. But as far as I can recall, none of them have anything to do with sustainability. In other words, 20% of GDP being spent, most of it's being spent on cushioning the blow of this economic disaster from companies and from individuals and from families. So that's really where the money has gone. Could it have gone somewhere else? Of course, we could have had an investment, and maybe now we're talking about a 5th set of support for innovation in particular areas, and some of that money might be directed specifically towards some kind of sustainability / green, you fill in the blank what. So it could have been used on sustainable outcomes. But when we look, and we've done a lot of tracking of packages, especially aimed at small businesses in the region, most of those are not about sustainability. They're not so much about the longer term future. They're about like saving people's livelihoods today and making sure they're fed today. And I think the challenge, of course, is that once you get through this, then government is going to have a lot less cash. It will be looking for cash. Governments will, and firms will be looking to survive again. And so I mean, again, great idea. Would love to support this, but I think the reality on the ground is that it's going to be difficult to engage in sustainability. And if it gets too expensive to export to Europe, many firms will say, well, can I make whatever I'm making? And it could be, in this case, a ceramic coffee cup, and ship it somewhere other than Europe. And so I think it will be interesting to see how this happens. Border tax adjustments are likely to be another snare that creates problems for businesses because they will not all be the same. So let's imagine that the Koreans come up with a package, Europe comes up with a package. They will not be the same. They will not have the same adjustment with the same levels, with the same way of calculating carbon. Now, they could, But I would take a fairly large bet that they will not be, which will create another challenge for export-oriented countries here in this region to participate in trade going forward. And let me just finish this off by saying, it is difficult for many Asian economies to domestically produce what they need. It's one thing if you're a Europe or a US or even a China, where you have enough resources, material, drive to market demand, et cetera, to produce things purely domestically within your space. It's another thing when you are Singapore or Cambodia or Vietnam to produce things domestically if you can no longer rely on an easy access to imports and exports. I think it's a real challenge.
And isn't that part of the objective on Europe's part to make ASEAN businesses consider the carbon content and make whatever adjustments they can over time so that they can continue to export to Europe? Debbie?
That's clearly the intention. I mean, is to, first of all, make sure that what is created and sold in Europe meets European standards, of course. And then if you want to participate in that market, you have to level up and meet those standards. We see this across the board in Europe on food and food issues. We see it on electronics and electrical equipment. I mean, there's, again, some of these arguments I think are perfectly fair. No one should have to buy a toaster that explodes when you plug it in. So, you know, standards important. I think the challenge is the gap between where you are and where you need to be. And if that gap gets to be too high or too challenging or too difficult, that's very hard. It's hard for firms, especially many firms in this region who rely on exports, to level up to the level of Europe. I mean, we are not Europe. So leveling up, not just leveling up a bit, but, you know, a massive jump, that I think is where it's going to get interesting here for Asian-based firms. Again, not all of them, because that's an unfair bucket to put everybody in, but many Asian-based firms who are traditionally exporting to Europe to make that jump on climate and all the other standards.
Cathy, can I bring you in here? I mean, what can your members do, and indeed, what can European businesses in ASEAN do to assist ASEAN to make this adjustment and level up to take Debbie's words?
Well, it's true that the current situation is very challenging. I mean, we've seen that the COVID-19 had quite has affected the global supply chain in unprecedented ways, and resulting, I mean, affecting billions of workers and reducing the trade levels significantly. But Debbie's been talking about the gap varies between the ambitions and the reality, which is true. But if I can say something about that, about what we observe at Amfori, before the outbreak, supply chain risk management principles were most of the time only applied to top tier suppliers. And the pandemic demonstrated the importance of lower tier suppliers, and that disruptions at these levels can cause actually serious disturbances throughout the supply chain. So anticipating and identifying risks require, I believe, strong and cooperative relationships between partners and suppliers, and having a clear picture of the fundamental structure of the supply chain will facilitate good and quick communication. And what we observe at Amfori is that those companies who were already working on trying to imply the sustainability of the supply chain and being serious about that, that means that they had that good knowledge of the reality of the supply chain, and they had like that relationship established with their producers, and because of that, they were in a better position to react more quickly to the changes and engage with the suppliers in a positive way. So so basically, that demonstrates that building resilient supply chain to some extent can go hand in hand with sustainable supply chains as well. But what I see with the future recovery packages and the one with the EU, I think it will really be a test to check whether economic recovery and sustainability are or are not mutually exclusive. That will be really the test for the Green Deal, and I will define the way forward. So that will be interesting to watch how things progress in the coming months and year.
Okay. I've had repeated questions in around the next theme, and Jake, maybe you might have a go at it initially. What lessons can the EU learn from the poor handling of the palm oil dispute by the Commission with Indonesia and Malaysia when it comes to selling the idea of the Green Deal in ASEAN? And I appreciate you're not from DG Trade, and in that sense, maybe you don't have all the details to hand, but in selling the Green Deal in ASEAN, the palm oil story definitely is not a good example of how to sell EU thinking in ASEAN. So your thoughts on that? And maybe Debbie, you might pick it up when Jake is finished.
Thanks, Noel, and thanks for the question. Just in terms of the exchange that we've just been having, it's my hope that that quite a few of the people who are operating businesses, making products, and seeking to access the EU market that might be listening in on the call are seeing as much of an opportunity as a challenge when they hear that the EU will be increasingly looking for sustainable products. Because I know that we do look to this region as a source of sustainable products. And that must be because there are manufacturers that feel that they can learn, understand, and meet the standards that the EU puts in place. Our 100% commitment is to be transparent about those standards, to abide by the WTO and other trade-related laws that are in place in terms of transparency, but also consistency with those principles, and to, as we always do, work with our partners to help with trade facilitation, so that if there are difficulties in meeting those standards, we can provide support in better understanding how they can be applied and complied with successfully. That, I'm sure, is what the Commission's intent was with regard to the palm oil proposal, to be transparent, to be clear as to why we felt it was essential that as we developed our renewable energy policies within the EU and recognized that those would need to rely upon feedstocks from food and feed-related crops, that we would have to ensure that those were being produced in a sustainable way and weren't undermining food security. That's where the debate about that is where those standards evolved from. And I'm sure my colleagues did a lot of outreach in the region to help partners understand the rationale behind those policies and why we felt that they met all those principles that I just described. My understanding is that those policies have not yet been applied, and there is still an open conversation about how to manage the impact of those policies with particular trading partners. And that does involve a conversation about reaching a common understanding of what sustainability means for palm oil production in Southeast Asia. So the conversation continues, and I'm confident that my colleagues are engaging with it in that conversation in a way that's constructive.
Debbie, do you want to follow up on that? And maybe while you're speaking,
Sorry, I got interrupted.
I'm sorry, Jacob, I thought you were finished. Yeah. Okay, I was just going to move across to Debbie to take that issue on, the palm oil story, but also what might be the effect on future free trade agreements, maybe currently in negotiation between Europe and ASEAN member states, and long-term between a region-to-region FTA, whether the way palm oil has been handled and now the Green Deal is encroaching, whether that will impact on FTAs between Europe and ASEAN in the future.
Okay. There's a lot of great points that have been raised here. So one of them has to do with standards in general and where the standards come from and how they get set, and whether the standards are considered appropriate for different jurisdictions. So sometimes the EU, it's not just the EU, but the EU likes to set standards that it thinks make sense for its own domestic market, as many governments would like to do. But when those get exported to other regions, they suddenly become the sort of default standards somewhere else. And I think that is often tricky. We see that In sustainability, probably. We've seen that with GDPR on data privacy issues, where suddenly we all had to respond to European standards. So I think it's tricky. Where do you make, who makes the standards? How do you make the standards? Is it a coalition? My guess is that that will take too long. And so Europe will come up with its own standards, and then we'll say, we've thought about this. These are the standards. You all should take them on because they're awesome, because we thought of them and they're great. So I think that's tricky. You know, transparency is great. Everyone is in favor of transparency, but I think transparency doesn't just mean we need to have a statement somewhere, but you actually need to roll it out, and you need to roll it out outside of Europe and in front of markets that matter. So if you're going to have a border adjustment measure of whatever kind, you need to explain in plain English and local languages what that means. What does that actually mean if you are a firm exporting, you know, carpets and tables and nails and screws into the European Union? What does that actually mean for my firm in a language that makes sense to the individual firm that is actually engaged in that transaction? And I think that is important and is critical, particularly when the European Union is setting a standard that is not obvious in many respects to this part of the world. So standards around sustainability and green is very contested, as you saw with the palm oil discussion. And if you're not engaging in a larger conversation and you're not transparent in a way that makes sense to folks on all sides of this, it's tough. And I think that the palm oil situation makes it harder to have a robust discussion about what does that mean, how do we set standards, et cetera. So it's, you know, it's a bit unfortunate that that's how it went down, but now that's a legacy that has to be addressed.
Jack, do you want to respond to that? It does seem to be the exporting of European standards, maybe a level of conditionality in trade agreements and some sort of extraterritoriality, at least from the perspective of ASEAN businesses.
Well, I mean, this is just the nature of trading relationships. Different countries and different markets have different standards, and that is the condition under which you have to enter that market. There's always been an extraterritorial aspect of trade-related rules in that sense. We don't think that they are extra-jurisdictional in the sense that they are consistent with EU laws and international laws and rights and obligations. So yes, there are spillover effects in a highly globalized economy. It's inevitable, and that is why we do reach out to and do seek to be transparent and clear in the way in which we're communicating the standards within in the EU. I know that the palm oil situation has been very controversial. And we're trying to deal with the diplomatic and the commercial fallout of that in a responsible way, including having an ongoing conversation about what sustainability of palm oil production can mean within the region.
Okay, thank you. Kathy, the EU-ABC chairman, Don Canuck, has sent me a kind of a comment with a question implicit in it. He points out that Jacob and Deborah are actually agreeing that the Green Deal will cause ASEAN firms that export to Europe to need to consider the carbon content of products. For Europe, that's the goal. For ASEAN, it's a challenge. But isn't it essential to make the carbon discussion part of mainstream business discussion and not just an issue for the energy sector? So I guess the question is, are your members taking on board all of the aspects of the Green Deal, both your members in Europe and your members in ASEAN, particularly those outside of the energy sector?
I think they're trying to. It's basically our role to keep them informed. But about the carbon tax mechanism, it's very early stage because the Green Deal has been announcing its intention to do something about that. We haven't seen the details. And yet they remain to be seen. I think they will be available sometime next year. But my understanding is that it's going to be very complicated to put in place because of WTO rules. So I'm actually very curious to see the details of that future proposal, because at this stage in practice, it's really difficult to assess the impact it's going to have on trade for the ASEAN regions or even for EU businesses. So at this stage, I cannot really comment on what are the likely impact of it, because we don't have enough detail, I would say. But what I would like to add is that with the COVID-19 crisis, I think EU businesses will need more than ever to source products efficiently and cost effectively. So that will mean that trade agreements will play a key role here. In the future, I don't see the EU pushing for an outstanding extra number of new trade agreements being developed in the coming years. It will be more like probably looking at the implementation and how to draw more benefits out of these trade agreements. But for instance, I see that the EU-Vietnam trade agreement that's going to be enter into force, I think, on the 1st of August, can potentially play an important role in the Vietnam's recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. I'm sorry, we embrace a holistic understanding of the relationship between trade and sustainability. So we believe that trade must be value-based. Our motto is actually trade with purpose. But we also believe that there must be a fine balance between engaging with partners on economic and sustainability issues. So we need to make sure that trade agreements are based on a win-win strategy for both partners. So, and find the right balance here. So that will be up to both the Commission and ASEAN trading partners to define what this win-win situation can be and try to solve this very sensitive issue with the palm oil that is currently preventing any progress in the trade negotiations. But it's for sure that an EU-ASEAN trade deal could be a game changer as well for both regions. I think I read somewhere, that by 2030, the ASEAN region will become the world's fourth largest single market. So there is potential. So indeed, I think in the future, dialogue between the EU and ASEAN will be really important, and I hope a common understanding and can be reached so that we can progress the trade discussions.
Thanks, Cathy. I see we are coming up to the hour, but if I could just slip in one last round of questions to capture rather a tsunami of questions coming in now, as is always the case on these webinars. The first one to you, Jake, and you can probably rest up then, is will the Green Deal include labour rights and human rights? And can we expect the EU to make its expectations in terms of sustainability and human rights clear through checklists or other such documents so that folks in ASEAN know exactly what EU expectations are in those areas? That's for Jake.
Well, thanks very much for the question. I'm not sure I fully understand it. I mean, the European Green Deal is primarily a set of domestic policies. We've been talking a little bit about the external dimension of it, but it's primarily a set of domestic policies, which would be governed by European human rights rules, which are very, very progressive and very well enforced throughout the EU. And as I mentioned before, have a particular focus on what we call the just transition. Recognizing that the transitions that we are describing, the green transition, the digital transition, are potentially very disruptive, particularly for those communities that are either dependent upon fossil fuel production and consumption or otherwise marginalized. And so we're ensuring that the resources that are available are made available as a priority to those communities that might otherwise be concerned about the nature of these transitions. So in that sense, they also have that progressive social dimension to them as well. In terms of the external aspects of it, I would say we operated as a provider of development cooperation and assistance consistent with the environmental and social safeguards, including human rights policies. around the world, and those would continue to apply in terms of any additional resources that were provided through the European Green Deal. Thanks.
Okay, Jake. Debbie, I have one further question for you, which is a variation of something that you touched on earlier. In terms of stimulus packages and recovery packages in ASEAN, to what extent you might be concerned that they are propping up industries and jobs that may not be sustainable in the long run, and in a sense result in zombie companies and retard ASEAN's possibility of meeting the standards of sustainability that the Green Deal may apply?
I think that's a real risk. You know, we see it here in Singapore, where for reasons that I find puzzling, so many of the packages deal with manufactured goods, even though this is a service-based economy. So if you are a services firm, your ability to access many of the 621 various schemes is limited. And so I think for me, that's a bit puzzling, because if you think about where the future is, innovation, big data, AI, all the things that the government here is talking about, they're often in services, not actually in manufacturing. So we have a bit of a disconnect, it seems to me, between the objective firms and jobs of the future and what's actually being funded. And I think that's going to be common if you look at the packages in a lot of different markets. What's actually being funded doesn't always line up as nicely as you would like with the aspiration of whatever the objective is. And I think, you know, that's just hard. Government has got to, they are just as strapped and confused as all the rest of us are trying to navigate this complicated situation. And so what often happens is you pull up whatever you've got available, you package it together, you roll it out as quickly as you can, and you hope that it works. So I think you can have aspirations about lots of things, but the delivery is maybe often not quite what you wanted. And that's part of how I see sustainability. Again, it's a great aspiration. We absolutely should have it. But I just think at least in the near term, and particularly in the recovery period, it's going to be tough. And I think I'll finish with this one. I'd kind of like to take a bet here with Jake. I would be willing to bet you that there will be a carbon border tax on my coffee mug, because if you think about the implications of this, it can't just stop at steel. It can't. It won't stop at steel. It'll go from steel to aluminum to things produced with coal fire and before you know it, the entire economy. So I think, again, I'd love to take a bet. You all listened. You heard his statement. It will never happen. Let's see what happens.
Thank you, Debbie. I'll let you and Jake take that offline and establish what level of bet you want to place on that. Last question for you, Cathy, and be grateful if you could be brief so that we can wrap up more or less on time. Do your members have insights as to the timeline, the process, the content? When I say your members, are members in Europe, but also in ASEAN, on the legislative proposals, on the detail, or should the EU push out more detail as to what the details of the Green Deal will be in all the various areas, so that companies can prepare for these requirements? So do you have enough information now to initiate preparation, or is there a need for more detail from the Commission in the first instance?
Well, we have the general direction from the Commission where they want to go, but we don't have all the details of the legislation. So this is something we will be monitoring, because, as you know, the devil is in the details. So that will make all the difference in practice for businesses. So that's where the potential gap between the aspirations and the reality lies. It's in the final piece of legislation and its detail and how it's going to work. So of course we will be monitoring this very closely in the next future, and as a business association, we are hoping that, and it's usually the case with the Commission, that they're going to take an inclusive approach and also involve businesses in these discussions, so that the approach can be as pragmatic as possible. Because ambition is a great thing, and I'm really in favor of that, and I'm optimistic by nature. So I think sustainability is indeed a great thing, but at the same time, we need to take the reality into account, and especially the reality of global supply chains, which are really complex. And so it remains to be seen how this aspiration and the pragmatic approach can be reconciled to take a coherent approach and end up with a piece of legislation or pieces of legislation that will actually have that will enable businesses to take advantage of the opportunities that the Green Deal was aiming to provide in the first place. Not only EU businesses, but also businesses outside the EU as well. So we'll see that when we have all the details, of course.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Jake and Debbie also. We have run over a few minutes. If you'll just bear with me, I'm not going to try and wrap it up. It's just far too complicated and there's so many angles to it to try and do it justice in any closing remarks. I think it's fair to say the EU Green Deal is here to stay. It's a signature policy initiative of this Commission. Jake described it in his opening remarks as a growth strategy. Kathy described it as a game changer, and it certainly is highly ambitious, regardless of whether people in ASEAN or elsewhere see it as extraterritorial. For sure, the COVID-19 story has changed the environment in terms of perhaps the timeline, the public support for, and the resources available for the Green Deal, at least in the short term. But I know the EU is certainly very committed to greening the recovery and to the extent possible making the fiscal packages aligned to and consistent with the Green Deal in every respect. So I'll just draw it to a close before I hand back to Chris by quoting from Geeta Gopinath, the IMF chief economist, who says, the COVID crisis won't change the climate, but the response will. So if we think that the COVID story is going to delay or deflect the Green Deal, I think that's optimistic. I think it is important that we push on with the Green Deal, whether you would agree with the details of it or not. So Chris, at that, I think we've had a very extensive discussion. I've tried to reflect the questions that have come through, but of course, always more than you can capture thinking on your feet. So I'm going to hand back to you to close and do the usual courtesies wrapping it up.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you very much, Kathy, Debbie, and Jake for taking part today. I think it was a very illuminating debate. There's clearly a lot more explanation that needs to be done, I think, on the Green Deal, a lot more understanding. But there are also, I think, great opportunities that exist there for businesses as well that can embrace it and are looking to become part of a more sustainable future going forward. Thank you, Noel, as well, for excellent moderation and taking us through and getting through those questions. It wasn't the easiest of subjects, but I think you did a great job. And finally, thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are. Please do look out. We have a couple more webinars coming up in the near future. One on the 17th of July, looking at the future of travel and tourism in Southeast Asia with Undersecretary for Tourism from the Philippines and the Vice President for Asia Pacific for Booking.com confirmed for that. And then on the 20th of July, one looking at illicit trade and the link to financial crime across Asia Pacific, and some more coming up. And finally, please, if you haven't done so, go to our website and complete the EU-ASEAN Business Sentiment Survey. There are questions in there, indeed, around the relations between the EU and ASEAN and how the EU and indeed ASEAN governments consult and work with companies in terms of developing regulations and policy ideas. With that, again, thank you all to our panel. Thank you again to Noel. Thank you to everybody else, and all keep safe and keep well. Thank you very much.